There we go. In about 10 seconds, the audio should kick on, because that's the time lag in the stream. Ta-da! Thank you, Jill. Well, she missed the best part, obviously. So we talked about this. And where it eventually led into was a wonderful conversation about addiction, mental health, but then also talking about all the things, all the societal identifiers that might cause us to look askance at others. So like, economic status, what else was up there? You guys remember?
Lots of skin things.
Lots of skin things. Ethnicity, sexuality, addiction, yeah, lots of body stuff, right? And so we never really did wrap this up, but we were in the middle of a discussion of like, okay, so what would that look like? This action of one, to be fair, it's not cast out, it's have authority over unclean spirits. I don't think we arrived at a conclusion. Am I the only one that feels that way? I thought we arrived at some very good questions, which that may be all the further we get with it, right? I think this is from the beginning of our course, is that despite the fact that it's so easy to think that we can put together a discipleship model and package it and publish it, what might be the value that we get out of this are actually questions, right? If after all we start with curiosity, right, where does that leave us? So let's actually get into talking about the mission and the sending the 12, and then we can cycle back around to the unclean spirits talk. So the sending is in all the synoptics. It's not in John. And what I mean by the sending the commissioning is, it's the 2x2, no sandals, blah blah blah. So I asked you last week what you remembered specifically. So let's do that one more time. What are the things in that sending that Jesus says in terms of instructions to his disciples that you remember? What sticks into your head? Somebody said 2x2 last week. Send out by 2. What else?
Only one tunic.
Only one tunic. Thank you, Carolyn. Stay with one family. No bag. What did you say, Ruby?
Dust.
Shake the dust off your feet. Yeah. So that was the, if you get to a household and they refuse to accept the peace that you offer, and by extension, we'll interpret that when we get there. Yeah, shake the dust from your feet as a sign of protest. We'll talk about that too. Stay with somebody who's worthy. Yeah. Judgment call. That's a really interesting question. We're going to have to talk about that as well too. Okay, so we'll start with Matthew. We can hop over to Mark and Luke as needed. But this account is one of the ones that when you look at a gospel parallel, right? So where it takes all the 4 gospels and lines them up. Well, not 4 gospels, the synoptics, and lines them up side by side. This is one where they all look the same for the most part. This is a shared narrative, which, sorry, get a little nerdy here, indicates that this is probably either a Markan thing, right? So Matthew and Luke are taking this from Mark, or it's a Q source thing where Mark took it from the Q source and took it, where Matthew and Mark either took it from the Q source or Luke. So it's a shared, there's not a whole lot of variance in this. So we're in Matthew chapter 10, starting at verse 5, if you want to follow along. These 12, so the preceding verses, let's read those. We'll start with, okay, so here's where we got stuck. Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew. I went back to verse 1 in chapter 10. Sorry, I changed my mind. I decided to risk the tangent. So these are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, known also as Peter, and his brother Andrew, semicolon, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, semicolon, Philip and Bartholomew, semicolon, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, semicolon, James, son of Alphaeus, comma, and Thaddeus, semicolon, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Sorry to emphasize the punctuation there, but there seems to be, on behalf of those translating the NRSV, the New Revised Standard Version, they seem to be indicating something that they see in the text, which is perhaps an intentional pairing of the names of the disciples. Did you pick up? Is that pretty clear? I would be curious to talk to a translator and ask them why they include that pairing. Is it a nod to what comes next, or is that in the text? I don't know. And the reason I say this is because Greek, the original manuscripts, whether Greek or Hebrew, are notoriously absent punctuation. In fact, if you look at the original fragments, it's just a wall of text with no discerning marks letting you know where even a sentence ends and begins. It's really confusing. Yeah. So what did they see in there that led them to break this up in ways? Any notices, any comments about the list of peoples?
Yeah, there's no semicolon after, let's see.
Simon.
Yeah, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and then Simon, and Judas Iscariot. So there's 4.
Yeah, a bit confusing. Yeah, Simon the Canaanian and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. I assume that they are indicating that Judas is the one who betrayed him, and that Simon and Judas are not the same person. But why does poor Simon the Canaanian get paired with Judas Iscariot? I don't know.
And why did he pair up brothers? Why wouldn't he separate brothers?
I don't know. That's a good question, Linda. We'll talk about that. Yeah. And this is the other thing is just kind of like paying attention to who is included in the 12 disciples. There's an uncommonly, a large number of siblings in this. Granted, the two major sets of siblings are recruited all together right off the bat. These are the fisher people that they grabbed from Galilee. Philip and Bartholomew, they don't even really give any family names there. So, something's up with that. And then Thomas, and this being the Gospel of Matthew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, which is interesting. Well, and again, this is reading too much into this because Thomas is really more abundant in the Gospel of John, but Thomas being the doubter, being paired with Matthew, the tax collector. Interesting. Okay, let's go on, unless you got any other stuff that you want to talk about. Okay. These 12, the aforementioned 12, Jesus sent out with the following instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Okay, full stop. Before we go on. That is found only in Matthew. This is not in either Luke nor Mark. Oh, I better check myself before I say that it's not in Luke. No, it's not in Luke. Okay. So this modifier appears only in Matthew. Here's my note about it. Talking about gospel audiences, which we talked about when we were doing the context of the Gospels last year. I don't know if you remember this conversation, but Matthew is arguably his intended audience are Jewish people who are debating. They're Jewish people who are curious about Jesus. So you could assume, you could make an assumption here that what Matthew is saying here is that you who are reading this, he was coming for you, right? You're the people that he wants to convert. It's not, I don't think, intended to be as exclusive as it sounds, because again, it's lacking from both Mark and Luke, meaning that Mark and Luke don't feel the need to identify that it's only the lost children of Israel, which is an interesting phrase as well too. Especially considering Luke is generally agreed to be a gospel that's written with Gentiles in mind, right? So of course, Luke wouldn't include that. Mark is the earliest gospel, so 60s, Common Era. Mark would just probably make the assumption that everybody that's reading it is Jewish, because at that point it wasn't widely spread at that point. Okay, sorry, I sidetracked myself. Verse 7, as you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You receive without payment, give without payment. Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, or sandals. Okay, hold on. Is he saying you can only have 1 set of sandals or no sandals? Come on, editor. Or a staff. Well, then that seems to me that it's no sandals at all. Bare feet. I don't know. Semicolon, for laborers deserve their food. What do you mean? That's awful. It's kind of a sudden, snarky statement.
Well, his staff, he's not talking about a staff to walk with. He's talking about laborers. Don't take them because they need to be fed.
No, I think he's talking about staff.
You think so?
Normally I would say maybe, but I think in this case it's specifically a staff. Okay. Because that statement, and again, I don't want to put words into your mouth here, but for laborers deserve their food. We could talk about that, absolutely. But it seems to be more a descriptor of what the disciples are doing, right? So they're saying, hey, you guys are going out to work. This isn't an all expenses paid trip to a 5-star hotel. You're in work for your food here. Does that make sense? But I like the idea, though, that they would be assuming that there would be a support staff that goes with them. This would be. My wife has been watching White Lotus. Anybody watch that show? I can't. That type of TV is just hard for me because there are no redeemable characters in that show. Right? She loves it, but this would be the White Lotus version of the sending the 12 disciples. Sending out 12 people who would just assume that their porters and support staff will be going with them. I like that one. I'm going to write that gospel. This is going to be a hit show on HBO. Okay, verse 11. Whatever town or village you enter, find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. Ooh, okay. Andy, that was yours. Find out who in it is worthy and stay there until you leave. That's kind of an obvious statement. Stay there until you leave. Come back to that one. As you enter the house, greet it. Hey, house. Right? Again, house probably most likely referring to the people that live therein, not necessarily the building itself. If the house is worthy, again, it's Bob Vila's version of, sorry, I'm bringing this morning. The house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. That's an interesting statement. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. This would be, in Hebrew, shalom. In Greek, it would be, not pax, that's Latin. Eirene, thank you. If anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, and anyone in this case might be applying to the town in its entirety, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Truly, I tell you, it will be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah on the day of judgment than for that town. Oof. Fire and brimstone sounds like. Okay, bookmark that. Let's go read Mark's version of it real quick. And it will be real quick because it's quick. Then he went among the, Mark 6, stop omitting verse numbers, please. Bible.org. Mark 6, verse 6. Okay. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff. What?
That's a contradiction.
Yeah, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts. but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. This is already a lot clearer than Matthew's version. He said to them, wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. Same confusing statement, except a little clearer in Mark. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. Sorry, I'm doing it literally while I'm talking. So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. So the interesting thing here, even from a textual standpoint, is that Mark seems to have, well, Mark didn't do it. Matthew broke out a lot of what Mark had written here, right? So Matthew took like this, they cast out many demons, et cetera, et cetera. He pulled that statement out, tacked it onto that introductory about, the naming of the 12 disciples. So Matthew obviously did some kind of like editorial work on his own, added several things in, but unfortunately in the process did not make it any more clear. The list of things. I'm just going to throw out there that debating over, staff, no staff, sandals, no sandals, is getting into the minutia. If we're looking at it, but we can debate that if you want. But if we're looking at it as a whole, right? These list of things you shall not bring. What's going on there? What do you think? If you were either one of the disciples being sent out vulnerable in that way, or if you were doing the sending, what do you think would be the motivation behind that?
Take nothing.
Take nothing. Why?
Because it will,
Finish. What did you say?
because it'll be provided for you.
Okay. Well, that's a good one.
And you're to give too.
And you're to give. Okay. So let me write these things down. Okay. Why? Oh, I forgot. Okay. So what did you say, Linda?
Because it'll be provided.
Will be provided. And Andy, you said.
You're to give and not take.
Yeah, intention is to give, not take. Paul.
There's a lack of paternalism in your giving here. There's a vulnerability that as you give what you have to give, others will reciprocate that. You'll be provided for in the relationship. So it's very much a vulnerable relationship where people give and receive. So as you're giving, you're also receiving because you're not providing for that ahead of time.
I'm thinking if we were in this day and age, they would judge you on what you come in with.
Huh. That's an interesting question. I'm just going to say judged, question mark. That is an interesting statement, Pat. Well, no shirt, no shoes, no service, right? What would, and again, okay, let's ask this question. This list of things, staff, money, sandals, no 2 tunics, what would a modern example of this look like?
Homeless.
Ooh. I'm just going to write that down.
What did he say?
Homeless.
So if we saw somebody that looked like that, yeah, that's probably a natural assumption, is that would be the person.
Is that, you're also depending on others' generosity.
Yeah, that was in here, and what Paul was talking about, vulnerability as a means of making you reliant upon the relationship. Yeah.
Well, isn't that also invoking part of the culture that says you have to provide for these people?
Yeah. Okay. This is something. This is a subtext in here that we have, but we don't have, which is a Hebrew, but it's not just Hebrew. It is a Near East emphasis on hospitality. Okay. And this is in that whole shake the dust from your shoes.
I remember what Sue told me a few months ago. They have to let you in because they're hospitable people, but not if you're a woman. If you're a woman, you stay outside the courtyard, and the man comes in.
And that would probably be, well, no. And here's the tough part, is that Near East culture, which is not, it's not a monoculture in the way that we often project it. But Near East culture in many examples resembles what it did 2,000 years ago, even. And depending on which part of the Near East you're in, for example, if you're in Saudi Arabia versus Palestine or Israel, different. But what does give us is it gives us insight into what things look like. And one of the things that holds true is this, and you are probably correct that there would have been a lot of social dancing, not literally, a social dance done around whether you were male or female. And here's an interesting thing, okay? We haven't really talked about this, but we kind of did in day one. It's 12 men, right? From a modern perspective, in terms of gender inclusivity and diversity and all of the values that we hold, wouldn't it have been easier if Jesus had picked, let's say, 6 guys and 6 girls, right? That would make our work of celebrating women in ministry a whole heck of a lot easier, right? But Pat, you've pointed out something which is a cultural norm that cannot be ignored, which is that if you sent 12 women out without, if you sent 12 women out vulnerable, you would probably have an extremely different experience. And I'm not sure we would have the Gospels. I don't know how to accept, because, what you pointed out, that they may not even have been welcomed into the home. Well, let's ask that question. If you sent a woman out and about in, let's say, the region of Galilee with only, one, whatever, garb she was wearing, dress, robe, tunic, no staff, no money, alone, or 2 by 2, what might people have seen her as? Okay. And let's just throw out there too that when we, from a modern perspective, the word prostitute to describe many women in the Bible is often a categorical thing that does not necessarily indicate that they're sex workers, right? But it's women who were independent, even merchant women. For example, Rahab in the fall of Jericho. Rahab was most likely not a sex worker, but was probably a single woman, potentially a merchant, right? Who was called a prostitute because society didn't have room for single women in that day and age. And I'm sorry, I'm throwing a lot out there, but yeah, if you sent 2 women to a household, right, vulnerable, and they said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near, it would be a vastly different outcome, okay? So, this gives us something to think about in our gender norms for disciples, right? Which we did talk about, right? Okay.
Well, with all of this being said, let's bring back in the comment from Matthew, which was the judgment call of wickedness, which is not from them to you, but you to them.
Yeah.
It's the disciples making a judgment on who you should enter. And yet you all this, that's like the jumpsuit.
It is. What qualifies the disciples to make judgment about who's worthy or unworthy?
Jesus said, judge them.
Yeah. At least, and it's not emphasized quite so much in Mark or I would assume in Luke, but in Matthew, is this house worthy or unworthy? Mark puts it a little bit differently, insofar as that if any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them, right? But Matthew brings in this whole other aspect of, finding them worthy or unworthy. And perhaps what Matthew is indicating is, this, are they listening to you? But we're building theoretically a model of discipleship. So let's throw that question out there. How do you judge who's worthy or unworthy? Go, Matt.
Well, let me address that. So, if you think about sort of our modern day culture war politicians,
Yeah.
what they do, some of them, is
Yes.
Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, if you think about the term woke, well, it's not only somebody that comes in and tries to tell you that there are things that you can do for yourself and for your community that will leave you better off. But where it goes is the messenger. These woke people are, yeah, they're trying to get you to not be a drug user. They're trying to teach you that, you know, postponing your child or your marriage, for example.
Yeah.
These are all people who think they are better.
Yeah.
Those are the woke people.
Yeah.
So when you get into these kind of, and I think what's going on here is the thing again, the Jesus is saying, look, you guys are just regular guys. You just are part of these communities. If you show up there with not on your back, you're going to be one of them. You know,
Yeah.
and that will enable you to have more credibility with the people that you're talking to, rather than some guy from the university office.
Matt, I'm gonna give you my cell phone and have you record that last 3 minutes. But hey, this is an interesting question. Would, you know, from a modern standpoint, would the disciples be considered woke?
They would be, but not. And what Jesus is trying to get them to do
Yeah.
is not. I mean,
Not preach.
listen to what
Yeah.
people say to people.
Yeah.
That kind of makes sense, you know.
Yeah.
Some of the stuff they say, I guess. But it's where it comes from. It's what kind of people.
Yeah.
What the anti-woke people are trying to say is no, they're the elites. Don't listen to them.
Yeah.
They know what's good for you.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that's why you're showing up with nothing.
And that's what Matt's saying.
It puts you in that humble stance
Right.
where you're having to look at everybody else to kind of define a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it also puts you in a position where you're much more able, talking about worthiness, to walk in their shoes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and a question I lobbed back there a moment ago, which we took in a different direction, which is okay, but it's like, what would a modern sending look like? So what are the things you would be sent without? Okay. Cell phones, maybe, right? You'd be clothed, I would assume, right? Maybe not a car, you know? You wouldn't have a Bible, right? Maybe you'd have a bus pass. I don't know. Because in that day and age, you could walk from village to village, right? I don't know how many of us are going to walk to, let's say, Madras or Bend or whatever. Maybe we'd only be expected to travel in and around Clackamas County. That maybe. But anyways, but you understand what I'm getting at here. It's like, you know, so asking that question, you know, what would this look like in a modern context? So maybe put yourself in that mindset. So let's say that you go to a neighboring neighborhood. Let's assume you walked there, okay? Maybe you may or may not have a cell phone. You don't have any money. And here's the tough part to translate contextually is that, again, they're walking from village to village, meaning that they're not going back to their hotel at night. So, you know, this is where this hospitality piece comes in. They need to find a place to stay there. There isn't a Days Inn around the corner where they can book even if they have any money, you know. So they are absolutely reliant upon the hospitality of the people that are there. Let's really quickly outline what hospitality means in a first century setting. We've talked about this before, but a quick recap. Hospitality is one of the cultural pillars or societal pillars for this culture. And again, it's not a monoculture, but this is one thing that is consistent, right? So much so that if we go back and read, one of the texts that's referenced here, which is not done by accident, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah is not about homosexuality. Sodom and Gomorrah is a failure in hospitality, right? A radical failure in hospitality. So the men that come wanting to know Abraham are not. You know, it's not a rampant mob of homosexuals. You know, I'm sure some preachers made that statement before. In fact, it's people who are exercising extreme xenophobia. You're a foreigner, you're an outsider, and their hospitality would require them to welcome people in. Right? This would have been the cultural expectation. Instead, they do the opposite. Instead, they try to do violence, right? This same concept is reflected in Judges 19, what I often refer to as the awfulest part of the Bible, right? Without exception, you know, with the Levite and his concubine, where they get to a town late at night and the men come to, they want to know the Levite, and he gets shelter from a man who welcomes him into his house, and instead they send the concubine out to be raped to death. And then they cut her body up into 12 pieces and FedEx each piece to the tribes of Israel. I'm being a little bit snarky here, but it's awful. It's
Only about the fact.
it's just about the FedEx. So both of those texts are examples not of sexuality gone wrong. They're profound and radical examples of hospitality, not only being failed, but gone to the other end of that spectrum, right? Does that make sense? So one more statement is that hospitality, you could argue, is to combat xenophobia and or prejudice and or all of the ways in which, or tribalism, right? Yeah.
I would imagine that this is not the E-Day form of, you know.
That's a good question. Oh, no. In Hebrew, no, that would be yada, to know. Yeah. So, to know. But that's very insightful, because that'll come up today.
Okay, they're vulnerable to presenting themselves vulnerable.
Yeah.
To the people they're going to. Part of that, might sound trite, but personal safety, not going in with
Exactly.
gold chains or, you know, a limousine, and expecting hospitality.
Right. So going into the wrong neighborhood with looking too wealthy, right, will be a risk, right? That might be the modern.
Jesus invested a amount of time.
Yeah. And this goes two ways. Paula. So dudes walking down the road with nothing are less likely to get mugged, right? Go to like the Good Samaritan story, for example, okay? Additionally, are they more or less likely to be welcomed into a home is an important question. Somebody shows up knocking at your door and they look clean cut, they look, you know, like a healthy member of society, to use that phrase. And they say, hey, my car broke down. Can I stay the night at your place? Contrast that with somebody that shows up with no shoes on their feet, carrying several days of road dust with them, saying, my car broke down. Can I stay the night? Who are you more or less likely to invite in, right? So this sort of cuts cuts both ways.
Tell them I'd call somebody.
What's that, Pat?
I said I'd call somebody.
Right, yeah. I'll call you a tow truck. I'll set you up at the local roadside inn, right? Yeah. So just going back to this then. So, you know, asking you this question, why are they sent out vulnerable? There's a lot here, right? And what I'm hearing is that a lot of it has to do with cultural expectations, but a lot of it has to do with, number one, the success of the disciples, the relative success, right? So Jesus isn't necessarily handicapping them, to use that term, you know, penalizing them. This isn't like he's trying to make it harder. Perhaps some of the things that Jesus is instructing them to is so that they will be received in a specific way. Andy, you were alluding to that, right? So your car breaks down in Eastern Oregon, right? Showing up wearing Wrangler jeans and a button-down John Deere shirt will probably may or may not predispose the locals to accepting you. And again, that's a rough example, but you understand what I'm getting at here. It's like you're fitting in to the community that's there. But additionally, and this was going back to what Paul said earlier, a lot of it is not about success or the lack thereof. A lot of it is about the impact that it has on the disciples themselves, right? So, and this is really an important thing to think about here, is that when we talk about this, and let's throw in a different word there, evangelism, right? Especially in the broader American culture, what is a successful model of evangelism? Well, in terms of like the metrics that you would look for as like this succeeded.
Converted people.
you converted somebody, right? You have successfully brought them around to your way of thinking. You know, have you found Jesus? You know, do you have 5 minutes for me to talk to me about your personal salvation? You know, and I'm being this is a caricature, but right, what does it look like nowadays? We haven't had any door knockers yet. Fingers crossed, knock on wood. I'm not inviting them. For those of you that have had people come to your door, what does that look like in a modern perspective? The 2x2s with the nice white shirts and black ties. How do they, or do they anymore? Maybe that's.
Oh, yes, they do. They've been to my house.
How do they approach? You know, do they have like a camp
If they
spiel?
came to my house, I would feel vulnerable.
Pat, you made a good point there. So you, and not to cast any aspersions about your age, right? But you, Pat, right? You would feel perhaps vulnerable if two young, strong men or women, you know, showed up at your door unexpectedly. That's profound. Because one of the things that this points out is just how different, but how similar our contexts are. So let's say two young, strapping lads, former fishermen, show up at the door of a widow's house in first century Israel. Do you think her experience would be any different from yours? Perhaps not. Perhaps not. Paul, you're marinating there.
Yeah, well, I think it's really crucial that the identity of Israel is reestablished by prophets over and over with this phrase. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Never forget that you are a slave in this world. A slave to what? You know, we have for 2,000 years been saying, well, 4,000 years been saying, slave to the sin power, right? And never forget that you are not cured yourself. As you go out and do this curing, you are not cured. You might only be cured in your curing, as a matter of fact. In other words, you don't have any status that isn't linked to my giving you authority over this destructive power in the world, this dehumanizing power in the world. And if you forget that, you become part of a hierarchy of oppression. And in your loving paternalism, you know, well, if they just become like us, then everything will be cool. You are actually creating another tribe. Yeah. And so this attitude is not one. I give you authority in order for you to have authority over, you know, other human beings, but over this power that makes us all less than God intended us to be. So this is a new Exodus here that's going on.
Yeah.
Never forget, right? We just had 400 years of slavery. Yeah. And now you think you're the experts? Yeah. You know?
Not to mention that reading this from a first century perspective, the other event that they would is the exile, right?
Absolutely. Exodus and exile are parallel. Right? And again, you were starting in Matthew, so he's got to be pulling on those
100%
things. In other words, what's our authentic identity versus our screwed up identity? And we always get screwed up when we have a superiority claim. That's very difficult for us in America because America is founded on a superiority claim. Yep. It's very difficult for us as Christians because Christianity has been subverted into a superiority claim.
It's in our gospel reading today as well too. Because we have some of our gospel readings to thank for that.
Who's the greatest among them?
Who's the greatest among them? It's me, John. Well, and we'll talk about this too, but it's the same, gospel author as well, who takes the Pharisaic Pharisaic and scribal leadership and refers to them unanimously as the Jews, right? Which affected our history, shall we say. And unfortunately, anti-Semitism did not begin with Hitler, right? Christianity, for pretty much all of Christianity's history, has exercised anti-Semitism in various forms, especially in the Middle Ages. It was, anyways, that's a different topic. And the same.
So this question about people who knock on your door.
Yeah.
We get that at our house somewhat often, and I can break them down into two groups: successful and the unsuccessful. The unsuccessful are almost always people from religious organizations, either LDS or
Jehovah's Witnesses.
And I noticed, and I'll sit there. I mean, having lived for a year in Utah and dealt with a lot of LDS people who I actually have a very high regard for, but have never taken the step to join them. I got pretty educated about their spiel, and so I could stand there for an hour and talk to their missionaries and have a lot of fun doing it. Realizing the whole time.
I know who you are now.
But the other group of people that is successful, and one thing I've noticed is that the religious groups stop at every door. They waste their time. The other group that is successful are these people that have these little, they have like a little iPad or something like that.
Yeah.
And they are trying to get me to.
Pest control.
No.
Okay, that's mine.
They know I have a high sales experience. It's the ones that are trying to get me to buy into supporting a public issue. Clean water, or clean air, or something that me personally.
You invested in.
Then donate on a monthly basis.
Yeah.
I've decided though, I'm gonna, instead of putting no soliciting, I'm just gonna put a sign up that says, this household is highly sales resistant. I like that. I like that a lot.
What sets them apart from the religious groups is that they know who I am. And they already have done background on Linda.
Oh, man.
And so they know I'm a Democrat. They know I've joined different environmental organizations. They know all this stuff about me before they even get there.
So they've already decided you're worthy.
Yes, they have.
And they're not wasting their time.
Let me throw out a question here, which is, regarding the real activities of these disciples. By the time they hit their 5th or 6th village, do you think they've got a process dialed in? Do you think they've got a specific type of household that they're looking for that they know is going to be
Receptive.
Yeah. Do you think that's what Jesus intended?
Yeah.
No. Well, I don't know.
You gotta, when you're judging who's worthy, you try random people, right?
Sure.
And this failed, this worked, this failed, so you're trying to find the people who will be receptive to the
This
message.
is a great question.
But then you also have the comment before the worthy, which is, don't go to people who aren't Jews, basically.
Yeah, in Matthew's version. Yeah, don't go to some area.
See, I haven't done any of the homework.
No, there's no homework. There's no homework. Okay, hold on. Oh man, you guys are giving us so much good stuff here. I'm gonna erase the board, memorize that. Take a picture, too late.
Jesse, given this model,
Yeah.
don't you think that, maybe they didn't start out with an entourage, but maybe they probably had developed, people started to follow them.
Yeah.
From community to community. The community is not too far apart. Wouldn't they have some local knowledge that would say, hey, go to Jesse's house.
Yeah.
He'll accept you in, he'll take you in.
Yeah.
But don't go over to that neighborhood.
I gotta think so, right? Because again, these villages are not distantly spaced. And they're these are people that talk to each other on the regular. If they're not meeting, on a weekly basis at the market or whatever. We know this because, right, when Jesus and his disciples hop back and forth across the Sea of Galilee, the crowds follow them from side to side to side, right? They get a bunch of, tour buddies that come with them. Meaning that travel and or intercommunication was a regular thing. So, yeah, here are the things we when we do kind of an idealized version of this we don't think about, which is, yeah, man, my village 5 or 6, they talked to somebody in the last village that probably told them, oh yeah, I know so and so. Because they'll welcome you, right?
I got a cousin, George, go visit George.
So, okay, bookmark that. Okay, I got seven minutes, and then I have to go. We have to go. Okay. Okay, one or two real quick things. Okay. We talked about hospitality. That is one thing that has to live in your brains. Okay. Hospitality and vulnerability are two real big concepts that we're playing with here. That gotta live in your brains when we're talking about this discipleship stuff. The thing we didn't get to is the thing that's hard for us to deal with, which is the shaking the dust from the feet. So what happens when you get rejected? Right? What are the consequences and the implications of that? And here is where we see a real departure from our modern evangelical models, right? And this is kind of what we're doing here. Is as much as we're building or trying to, most of our work is actually deconstructing what Christianity has taken to mean by discipleship. Do you understand what I mean by that? We are, right now, actively tearing apart what Christian institutions have come to take discipleship and evangelism as. And again, we talked on day 1 about how you can't conflate those two ideas, right? But that's also part of what we're deconstructing. So we're doing that. Shaking the dust from your feet has sometimes been taken, well, they didn't accept me, too bad, they're going to burn in eternal damnation, And it sounds silly to us, maybe, but there is a lot of that. In fact, Matt, you're talking about the culture politics, the identity politics of today. That fuels a whole lot of it, right? Many of the issues that are at the center of our culture politics, in one way or another, relate back to the idea that people who don't follow a specific way of life are going to suffer for eternity, and therefore you need to do whatever it takes, because their eternal salvation is at stake, right? That is a zero-sum game. Okay.
From your perspective.
From my perspective, yeah. Okay. Shaking the dust from your feet.
Could that just be don't let them influence you?
Could be. But it's also symbolic. It's also symbolism, right?
What was the statement?
Andy said, could that also, what did you say?
Could that also mean don't let them influence you?
Yes. And it's also profound symbolism, right? So what happens when you walk from one village to the next village without paved roads? Your feet are dirty. What's one of the first things that's offered according to hospitality as soon as you enter a house? A bowl of water to wash your feet. If you are having to shake the dust from your feet, that household refused to offer you the basic level of hospitality. Does that register? Right? So this is not, you're going to hell forever. Right? This is, you did not do the thing you're supposed to do. Right? You did not offer hospitality, which you were once slaves in Egypt. Which usually precedes, whenever you hear God or the prophet harping about you were once slaves in Egypt, it precedes, therefore, when dealing with foreigners or dealing with others, essentially exercise the same kind of grace that you receive, right? And I'm really paraphrasing.
I've got to jump here.
Go.
Just to the idea that shaking dust off my feet is not sitting in regret.
Yes.
Not sitting in my failure to convert.
Yes.
Not sitting in my shame.
Yep.
That somehow or other they didn't accept what I had to say.
But also not sitting in vengeance or anger or resentment.
Not sitting in regret.
Yep.
Right. And that's crucial for us as we see our model of an alternative kingdom of God being rejected left and right.
Yeah.
People do not come to our liturgy because it doesn't mean anything to them.
Yeah.
There's nothing to say to them.
Yeah.
Right. But if we spend time regretting, oh gosh, we must have done something wrong that we're not doing, rather than going, boy, what does it mean to be one of them?
Yeah.
Maybe we are one of them more than we want to realize.
Yeah.
And that's got some vulnerability to it because I have to continually suss out what I'm going to keep, what I'm going to throw away, what authority is, what it isn't, all that kind of stuff. So if we can get past
Yeah.
What did it want to be? It wanted to be a light to Milwaukee, right?
Yep.
It wanted, and not just Milwaukee, right?
Yep.
And to see that people have rejected it, so to speak. And again,
Feels like a rejection of us.
well, it is a rejection if you go, gosh, this percentage of local residents was attaching itself to these churches, and now demonstrably not. If you stay in that regret, that space of mourning, as I have done too much in my life.
Yeah.
You say that. Then we cannot follow this light that's come to us. And we can't be the light if we're just going, oh, you rejected me, oh, you rejected me, oh, you rejected me.
And it's not just, and it's not just you rejected me. It's, you know, you hear this, like, you rejected God, you rejected the faith, you know, right, which worms its way in there. And here, okay, by the way, this is going to be your homework for next week. There is no homework, but this is your homework. Okay, is what I was intending to do with the last 20 minutes that I knew I wasn't going to get to, and that's good, is we spent an hour deconstructing, right? Let's try to construct something, right? Again, this is not the thing, this is a thing, right? So we have taken apart the parts of the story. We have analyzed and looked at them. We've said no to many of the current models that we have experienced. So taking all of this stuff, this conversation about vulnerability, about hospitality, about context, about how you're received, about shaking the dust from your feet, about all these things, what we're going to do next week is we're going to piece together, I don't have better language, not a model. We're going to piece together actions or best, what's the core? Best practices. We're going to put together, oh God, we've fallen into the institutional trap. We're going to put together discipleship best practices. We've done it. We've come full circle back into teaching. We got 3 weeks. Wow, this is going to maybe extend beyond this year. We'll see. But here's one thing I didn't want to leave you with, because Paul brought up a really good thing there, which consider the reverse implications of. The model of evangelism discipleship that is prevalent, right? This door knocking model that we've talked about and experienced, okay? Which in some way is trying to mimic what the disciples were doing, right? Has one major flaw in it, right? Which is that there is no need for hospitality, right? Okay? So the people that are showing up to knock on your door, even though they might appear vulnerable, are not vulnerable, right? Because there is no obligation that you have towards them. In fact, most people would just point at the no soliciting sign. Or do like I do, which is stand in the window and see if they let you out. My dogs take care of this now, thankfully, right? Again, I don't get many door knockers, maybe it's because of macaron, which I'm okay with. But here's the thing, is that if hospitality was such a core piece in this context, where does the burden of hospitality lie? Is in fact hospitality potentially a core best practice in when we talk about discipleship, right?
As part of the system.
As part of the system, and who might be expected to provide the hospitality? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe it's all of the above, right? And well, leave it for next week. Leave it for next week. That's going to be core to our conversation. All right.
Could you just change that E to an I? It's really hard for me.
That's Scuttleshot.